Good morning. I'm Daniel Hastings, professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT and the president of AIAA. So in this very important session, in this day focusing on foundational science and technology, we're going to examine the interplay between political priorities, scientific innovation, and the aerospace research community in shaping the future of public and private research funding. The way we're going to run this session, we're going to start with, I'm going to ask each of these fine people to introduce themselves briefly to, in a sense, give you their bona fides relative to this topic. Then I'm going to ask them some questions to set the stage. And then, after that's done, we will open it up to your questions, which I should be able to see on this. So, let's get going. So with that, Tim, briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, you bet. So Tim Lewin, Georgia Tech. I'm the Executive Vice President of Research. So just a couple, so what that means at Georgia Tech is we're about $1.5 billion research organization. About a third of that is what we call the academic side, which is campus research. The other 2/3 of that is very applied. We host a university-affiliated research center, a UARC, which is a really neat national innovation for taking innovation out of the university and injecting it into the national security domain. I also lead all of our commercialization as well as our extension programs. So it's a really interesting portfolio to kind of see the interplay of basic science, applied work, corporate engagements, startups, and things like that. And I think just kind of my framing for starting, and I'll repeat this many times, is obviously there's a lot of dust in the air, there's a lot of concern, but I think it's also, if we think about, for those of us in the room, within our sphere of influence, the things that we can do is, let's be good listeners. I think in particular I'm speaking to my academic colleagues. That near-term mission urgency is important, and it's a very reasonable concern of our administration to want to get stuff out there quicker. Acquisition reform is certainly a very real and legitimate thing to do, and so let's figure out how we can line up to support that. But then also recognizing that long-term capability development and stewardship of capabilities and building foundations and even basic discovery is also really important. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and how we balance those, in particular how we really synergistically bring those together.
Great, thank you. So, Carissa.
Hi, I'm Carissa Christensen. I'm the CEO of Bryce Tech. We are an award-winning analytics and engineering firm, and we support federal government agencies in space and other deep tech arenas, including NASA's SBIR program and STMD at NASA, the Space Force, Space Command. We also publish reports on dynamics in the space economy and across the space ecosystem, and do essentially strategy support for government and commercial clients, relying on that very evidence-based, non-advocate data set. And many of those reports are on our website, openly available, so I hope that you look at them. And then I also kind of have an advisory hat. I sit on the World Economic Forum Global Future Council, the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy Advisory Group. I'm a senior advisor to the Space Force's Schriever War Game. I am an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School. I am very fortunate in that I get to see space activities and space decision-making across commercial, national security, and civil realms. And I think that cross-domain perspective is really important to understanding where we're going and how to position effectively to be part of what appears to be a significant growth period for space.
Okay, Camille?
Hi, good morning. I'm Camille Lane. I apologize ahead of time. I lost my voice last night. I guess this Florida weather does not agree with me. But I'm the CEO and founder of a startup venture called Arusha Space. We're focused on AI, ML solutions for space missions across multiple domains, including Earth observation and lunar exploration. But before I started my company, I spent 30 years at NASA with some years at DoD. As a senior executive, I retired as the deputy manager for the commercial LEO development program, which is the future commercial space stations. We heard Peggy talk about Axiom Space. They were one of our partners. And before that, I was the deputy manager for the commercial lunar payload services. So I have extensive background and experience in developing commercial partnerships at the government level and the policies and strategies that we develop. Now I bring the industry and startup perspective to our discussion.
Great, thank you. So now you know what each of these people bring to this. As I said, let me start with some framing questions. So first of all, since this is about foundational science and technology, what do you think is the value of foundational science and technology?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll tackle that one. I think so. So first of all, I think it's very clear that foundational science and technology has a huge value. So let's just start there. But also, it's very much I want to really frame my answer in terms of how foundational science and technology is organized and how it's embedded in institutions. And so it's worthwhile just to kind of take a step back. And again, since I'm wearing the university hat, just to think about how did research universities come about and kind of what's their structure? And so, you know, a major innovation is actually the German model was embedding teaching and instruction with research. And then Johns Hopkins really brought that model over to the US, and it's really kind of the key model for what we call research universities. Didn't have to be that way, this idea of embedding education in research. You know, we could have discrete research organizations. We do have other discrete research organizations, but that's where that came from. But also, I want to talk about agriculture for a minute because I think it's very relevant because a distinctively American innovation was this idea of land-grant universities and the idea of establishing universities which are training people in practical arts. And I'm going to talk a lot about impact and how the diffusion infrastructure of our country, how are we getting innovation out there, both in terms of content but also speed. And so one of the things that these land grants did, I mean, I think it was, first of all, it was a really important innovation in diffusion infrastructure, but then they also, a follow-on was this idea of extension programs, and really the first ones were agricultural extension programs. And most land grants in the United States today have an agricultural extension program, and those do two things, right? They take all the creativity and innovation in universities, and they bring it to bear for people dealing with everyday problems. They take it to the streets, so to speak. But then it also has a really powerful cultural ethos in those organizations, this idea of public service. So similar thing happened, actually the state of Georgia and the state of South Carolina took sort of the next step, and they established what were called industrial extension programs. The United States government essentially generalized these into what is now called the Manufacturing Extension Program. It's organized under the Department of Commerce. But again, the whole idea is, again, how do you take innovations in robotics and AI and whatnot, again, take it to the streets for small and medium-sized companies. So for example, I oversee our manufacturing extension program. We worked with over 800 companies last year. These are companies, some of them have 3 people, 4 people, some went to college, some didn't. But again, this idea of organizational design around diffusion infrastructure. And then the last innovation I would really highlight is this idea of university-affiliated research centers, which is very much focused around national security. And again, the idea there is we have a large, I'll use the acronym UARC. The idea of UARCs, again, is this national security mission embedding in a university such that you've got this stream of workforce, you're benefiting from innovation, you have this trusted, impartial, and these are really interesting and exciting, I think, US innovations in terms of that diffusion infrastructure. And so if I then just back up and say, okay, so what do research universities do? Research universities, they discover things. It's super fun and exciting to discover something new. Some of it's super practical and important. Some things may never see the light of day other than just being beautiful, right? So we discover, we create, but we also deploy. And I think really the idea is how do we build these synergistic, self-feeding things where those things are all happening at the same time and they're mutually reinforcing. And just to emphasize, the act of doing research is itself beneficial, but also just that process itself trains people. It trains people who can frame problems, not just solve problems. And just, I think overarching the idea is foundational research is clearly an enabling infrastructure for national competitiveness. But it's also, it's most defensible. It's most defensible when it's embedded in institutions that also deploy. It's most defensible when it's connected to real missions and to real users. And it's most defensible when we're very proactive and visible in how we are seeking the public good, we're serious about the public good, we're listening, and so forth.
Okay. Let's see if we can get a grounding in where we are today. So where are we? What is the funding that's going in there?
Well, it's interesting right now. So let's try to get a sense of, fiscal year 24 to 25 to 26 for the major funders of space research. So that's NASA, that's the Space Force. There are others, but let's talk about them for the moment. From fiscal year 24 to 25, the same, but not. So what I mean by that is we had a year-long continuing resolution, meaning agencies had the same budget in 25 they had in 24. However, they probably didn't spend as much. Some programs may have come to an end, and there are rules about new starts. There were a couple of periods in 2025 where either OMB or DOGE was pausing, sometimes reducing, sometimes canceling contracts with government contractors and with research institutions. And we don't have a full accounting of what that looks like that I've been able to find. So it's difficult when we talk about 26 and people say, oh, it's an increase or a decrease. That's a little opaque in itself. But roughly, 24, 25, pretty consistent. 26, the president's budget request for NASA included a very significant cuts in science. In particular, I think it was a 50% cut in the Science Mission Directorate, and many other significant cuts. The president's budget request, the administration's sort of statement of what it envisioned for the Space Force was roughly stable. Two things have happened that have really changed the forward-looking the outlook compared to that prediction of reduction. First, congressional action. So we've seen just last week a NASA appropriations bill passed the House. It's got to go to the Senate, and so it could certainly change some more. But that is roughly the same. That is not a significant drop in NASA's budget. Space Policy Online, an excellent source, said it's a 1% decrease in the budget. Science Mission Directorate is a 1.6% increase, but that 1.6% includes moving, you mentioned the CLIPS program, over to exploration, so not quite as significant an impact. And again, that'll go through a Senate process. So if that's all we were looking at, the typical appropriations process, we would seem to be settling in a roughly steady state mode, recognizing that there are some puts and takes within programs, within priorities that certainly can have big effects on a particular program or department or company. But that's not the full story. The other really interesting and unusual part of funding for space activities in 2026 is the reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed in, I think, July. And that act establishes long-term funding targets and mandatory expenditure areas for different agencies, including NASA and the Space Force. It's difficult to say exactly how much of that funding is going to be spent in fiscal year 26. As I understand it, the NASA amount is probably around $2.5 billion, recognizing that so some of that, about $1 billion of that is for SLS, there's gateway funding, and there's some other funding as well. So very much operational exploration, and then there's some infrastructure spending either in that or in the baseline bill. So that's a very big change. And on the Space Force side, the numbers even arguably bigger, potentially $10 billion for a Golden Dome startup, essentially. And that's not strictly FY26, some of that started in 25, but that's really where the action is. So it's so interesting to me. We've had this period and this experience of tightening of purse strings for space activities, and suddenly now we're looking at significant increases, largely focused on exploration or Golden Dome defense, with a very operational focus. Recognizing, however, that there is still very low TRL work to be done associated with both Artemis and with Golden Dome. So I think that does really change the landscape and really create an imperative for academic organizations, for research organizations, not to mention companies like ours, to position themselves to help deliver on the objectives that those funds are aimed at.
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, maybe just even more generally beyond space, is like it's first of all, it's super confusing, especially if you look back over the last year. But if you're just trying to make a mental model of what's happened and what's going to happen going forward, I think one is just kind of top-line budgets. And again, I think to your point, top-line budgets, sort of, there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system. If you looked at the 6 bills that have now made it through the House, you know, there's a lot of funding for science, whether it's NASA, whether it's Department of Energy's NNSA, whether it's Department of Energy's Basic Science, whether it's National Science Foundation, whether it's Commerce, and things like that. So there's certainly top-line dollars out there. I think the other part around it is just timing of cash flows. If we look at the last year, again, to the point of lots of disruption, we saw some cancellations, but then also there was a lot of research universities saw a massive surge in new awards in August and leaking into September as agencies were just trying to rush FY25 dollars out the door. And so it was kind of confusing, like what? We've had the biggest month in our history, even as we're thinking about overall declines. So I think it's easy to confuse sort of timing of cash flows and top line dollars. And then the last thing I think is just kind of government philosophy of where they spend money. And I think that's one of the things that as we try to reconcile Trump 1 versus Trump 2 administration, you know, I think there's been some significant differences on sort of the philosophy and posture of funding very basic things versus very applied things and things like that.
Actually, let's hear from Camille on that. So certainly if you listen to the rhetoric out of the Department of War, they say they want more startups, more venture capital people involved, as well as non-traditional aerospace companies. So how can the research community actually partner with and facilitate this?
And
I'm a startup, so how do you do it?
1,000%. And that interest by DoD is real. I know a lot of startups that started as space startups exclusively, and now they're trying to see how they pivot or expand their capabilities, because where the money really is in the defense budget, right? And so there's that whole momentum moving towards that. But what we care about as startups is there's a market. The market size is their customer signal. Can we take fundamental research and translate that to prototype, then to production, and scale that? That's what we care about, right? So we're not interested in research projects, but we are interested in those capabilities and those areas that have potential to be scaled. And you talked about that. You talk about being able to take your research and deploy it, right? We're looking at those areas. And so I think from a fundamental research perspective and the research community, you can really help industry and early venture startups by de-risking technologies and helping us translate from that research into products, right, and production and being able to scale. And so that's where I think the synergies come in. I think there's a lot of perception that there's competition between the research community and industry, and sometimes we see that when NASA or DoD puts out an RFP and they say it's open to everybody, it's open to commercial, it's open to research, it's open to academia, and we look at that sometimes as competition. But I think there are more opportunities for us to partner together. I think the SBIR, STTR program was set up to be able to bring that partnership, to be able to de-risk technologies and innovations so that young companies, early venture companies, could take those innovations and scale it. And so I would love to see more of that and more of that partnership, because I think there's value and utility in what the research community brings to industry and early ventures.
Okay. Let's ask a different question. So if you read the newspaper, lots and lots of discussion about what's happening in higher ed. There's a lot of pressure upon universities from the administration. So one could argue that what happens in aerospace, at least as far as universities are concerned, is just a casualty of larger concerns in administration and more broadly the public perception of higher ed. So what about that? How are these funding challenges a special opportunity for the aerospace community? Should something different be done? Should we respond in a different way? I mean, you're at a university. Are you affected?
No, I think about this all day, every day. I think, and I think, so I'm a glass half full person, but I think my glass half full approach is very warranted. This approach to this, I think the aerospace community has a special opportunity to provide guidance to our country more generally on research universities, on how we do research and things like that. So I mean, I think first of all, we just have to acknowledge the reality, and I'll just start by poking a stick in the eye of all the academics in here, and since I'm one, I can do that, which is that certainly aerospace R&D funding has been been hit in the crossfire of some broader culture war issues, some broader issues around universities. And I think the simple fact is, for 20 years, public sentiment of higher ed has been monotonically, year on year, going down. Yeah. Right? Public distrust in higher ed. What have universities, frankly, have demonstrated, at least sort of overall. I think there's a lot of great models of one-offs, and I think my university is a good example of an exception, but that's another story. But I think have shown that they are not willing to reform themselves. So it sucks, and it's been really painful. But I think just the simple fact is that just the idea of the value of a higher education and just the idea that institutes of higher ed, particularly public universities, are there to serve the public. We got to remember that. That's true, right? And so, but I think aerospace is uniquely positioned to sort of provide a great data point and case study of how this can look, right? I think clear line of sight from fascinating basic research, discovery-oriented things towards mission-focused, national security, economic development, domestic manufacturing stories. Clear line of sight. Long history of mission-driven science. Deep interdependence between universities, industry, government. Like this conference is a great example. You know, it's not, you know, there are a lot of fields where it's just a bunch of academics or just something else. So I think if we read this less as anti-university than sort of pro-accountability, I think we can learn a lot. Certainly not justifying a lot of the things that are happening out there, but I do think it's a good opportunity for this community to really say this is what an effective model can look like.
Okay.
And if I could jump on that, and this applies both to research institutions and to companies. Engaging with the acquisition process, whether that's for grants or whether that's for contracts, has changed. It's changed in the last year. And it's changed in a few ways. One, the personnel involved have changed. We saw very significant outflows of senior contracting and other senior professionals from the agencies that we work with. And that means that for just about everyone, long-standing relationships have been disrupted. That is challenging. That's also an opportunity to build new relationships with the new actors who are managing this process. Two, the administration, I think, is very serious about, I hate to even say the words acquisition reform because everyone is always serious about acquisition reform. But we are seeing, we've seen the other technology, transaction authority consortia increasingly be used. We're seeing an effort to focus more on acquiring things commercially, rather than having the government operate them and kind of pushing that boundary. We're seeing increased scrutiny on costs. The competitive price range for contracts over the last year has come down noticeably in many, many different areas. And so success as a research institution, success as a government contractor or as a company with the government as a customer, fundamentally, you exactly hit it, it's customers, it's market. So fundamentally, that interaction with the acquisition process, that is where success happens, ultimately. And so in terms of, in maybe a more near-term tactical way for your organizations, are you investing appropriately in the skills and expertise to engage with that acquisition process, given that it's changed? If I'm looking at my budget, and I am looking at my budget, shifting more resources in that direction, I think is really, really going to be fruitful because the pathways for that money sloshing around the system will be different.
Okay.
Can I just piggyback on what Carissa said? When I tell you, for me as a founder of a startup and knowing other founders, we're so excited about the new acquisition approaches. As somebody who spent 3 decades in government, I know the traditional acquisition, contracting, where there are all these traditional cast of characters, and it's hard to compete as a new entity in the contracting government space. And so bringing these new approaches, wanting innovation, wanting commercial companies, we're very excited about that because now it's an easier entree for early startup ventures or commercial companies to get in where traditionally we would not have been able to play before.
Or the incumbents who embrace the idea they have to be agile and endure some uncomfortable change.
Yep, for sure.
Well, okay. Let me accept all that. But I want to press you guys. This is about foundational research. And I've heard members of this administration argue that industry should step up. By industry, they probably mean startups, I'm not sure exactly, and help fund foundational research. Do you buy that? Will industry step up and replace money that's lost from the government? We're talking about the government now.
But industry has always had, big industry, big companies have always had budgets for small, but for doing innovative things. That's how they feel like they keep their competitive edge. So they've always done kind of foundational types of research so that they could, be that competitor. So I don't see that changing.
You don't think it's changed?
So this is a long and proud tradition in the space community, is trying to get government-funded activities over to be commercially funded activities.
Yeah.
There have been, so many waves of this over the last few decades. This one is interesting, this particular topic of basic research or fundamental, foundational research, let's call that. And it really depends on the arena that you're speaking about. One example that I think is really interesting, where absolutely industry is leading the research side, is compute and information technology. And for decades, that was government-led. That's where the expertise lived. But as that moved into a commercial practice, created new demand and markets, suddenly it makes sense for me, a company, to invest in that rather than relying on research from the government, because even that, fairly foundational research potentially has a path to profit for me. So that's worth doing. There are so many applications that absolutely, there are so many research areas that absolutely don't fit that model, where the only customer is the government, and that may be the military as well as say NASA or the Science Foundation. So I think that in many cases, no, it probably isn't going to work. In some, it will. And I also, I just wanted to highlight, so let's talk about Golden Dome. Large money program, very much applications focused. Basic research gaps. Sensing for discriminating decoys from missiles, assured decision support under tight deadlines and in response in that very complex, crowded space environment. There are a number of survivability questions. Artemis research gaps, partial gravity, radiation effects on human health. So I would also kind of bring us back to the idea that these mission-oriented programs still have some really foundational work that has to be done. That may be acquired differently.
We're about to go to audience questions.
Okay.
Do you want to go to audience questions?
Well, yeah, I just gonna say, there are some things that only government can fund. But then also, again, just this idea of a portfolio, just of stewarding this portfolio of things where you don't necessarily know when and where the commercial outcome will be. So AI, the private sector has totally picked that up. Self-driving cars, private sector. But there's numerous other areas, I think history shows and the future will show, where it's really important to steward this broad portfolio, where absolutely industry will not.
All right.
Or the government may determine that it's beneficial to have multiple industry actors with access to a particular technology rather than one.
Yep.
So it can be a very tactical decision for competitiveness.
Yeah, you don't put all your eggs in one basket.
So we've got about 25 minutes left. Let's go to audience questions, and thanks to the magic of something funded by the commercial world, they're coming in right now. So there's a set of questions that go to another way of funding, which is, how do you see the role of foundations impacting research funding? And also another question asks, what about philanthropic funding? Are these possibilities in this changing ecosystem?
I mean, certainly, I think there's a lot of looking at philanthropy and foundations. And I mean, if you can, National Science Foundation publishes something, HERD, and if you look at where there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system, 95% of it is in the life sciences. So if you can figure out how to save kids' lives or how to deal with cancer, you're going to find a funder. I think other areas, there's certainly an opportunity, but it's going to be a much smaller pie. But absolutely, that is a piece of the overall portfolio. But
also
just
environmental.
Pardon?
There was a lot of money, philanthropic money put into environmental and climate.
Yes.
That's right, but I'm just saying if you stack them up, environment is still probably 10% of health and life sciences for philanthropy in this country.
I also think that, so it's interesting how you frame this. One framing is from a national perspective, in order to ensure a robust foundational research program, the government should be actively funding across as many areas as possible. Another perspective says the government's role as a steward of taxpayer dollars is to be very targeted and thoughtful about what only the government can fund, what the government views as a priority for funding to make it broadly available or to ensure geopolitical competitiveness, and encourage or foster through all of the tax breaks and so on that philanthropic money has access to, but kind of let the philanthropic marketplace, as it were, play out. And I think the reality is probably somewhere in between. So I don't know that most of us would argue that the government has to control the research agenda across the board in every respect.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question. Obviously, there's a number of people here who are students. For research funding, what does this mean for potential students and for fellowships?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, there's a lot of it's very confusing. I'll just acknowledge that it's very confusing on many levels, right? And so you can hear a lot of gloom and doom, but I mean, just again emphasize there's a lot of money in the system. If you look at NSF's budget, and NSF has a large fellowship program, you know, there is a significant amount of money for student fellowships. So I mean, I think my advice is that this is a great business to be in. It's a great field to be in. The pendulum swings back and forth. It's a great lesson in resilience, in building a funding base with lots of orthogonal funding sources and things like that. But absolutely, this is a great field to be in.
Any other comments about students?
Just so we don't forget the good news as well. Do you remember the days, they were not so long ago, where it was so hard to deal with a PhD student who needed to do a flight experiment because you could actually never get them on a flight? And now the flight rate is dramatically increased. Small payloads are routine. So I certainly do think that it's got to give you pause. The narrative around and the actions to shift research funding, but it's so much better time to be an aerospace graduate student in some respects than it used to be, even a few short years ago.
Well, okay.
I think the research community has an obligation to make sure that they don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is, even if there are tactical mission needs that our government is focusing on, research communities need to protect core fundamental capabilities that may have long-term payoff, right? And so students are not thinking, oh my God, I remember I'm dating myself in the early 90s. One of my grad degrees was focused on hypersonics, aerodynamics, and propulsion. I was at the University of Maryland, College Park. They were one of NASA's 3 centers of excellence at that time, where NASA was pouring money into hypersonics because it was a big deal. And then that fizzled away because we lost interest in hypersonics. Here we are, fast forward 2 decades later, and hypersonics is the biggest thing, or one of the biggest areas, right? And so we lost students going into hypersonics over those years when there was a dip. And now it's a big thing again. So the research community needs to make sure they protect some of these core fundamental capabilities, and so that students could aspire and they don't feel like, oh my gosh, there's nothing I'm really interested in that I want to go into.
All right. Well, let me just press something you said. So at my institution, the School of Engineering, average time to PhD is 5.5 years. That seems like a long time now relative to this fast-changing environment. You think research money is around to support a PhD student for that long?
I mean, this is...
Maybe it's much shorter at your institution.
I mean, for you and I both, this is our headache, right? Our average contract is 3 years and a PhD takes 5. And so we have to, so there's a lot of financial management that goes on in there at the administration level.
Yeah, okay.
But it is a solvable problem.
All right, okay. So Chris, here's a question that looks like it's aimed strictly at you. It says, how is research funding trending outside the United States? I know organizations like Bryce operate in Europe, so you get data from a number of sources.
Well, it's an excellent question. I can't quote you sort of chapter and verse on numbers. My general sense is that there are certainly some pressures on research funding. Where you're seeing real money shifts in Europe is toward national defense. Right, so France, Germany, the UK, outside of Europe, but Japan, Australia, are, particularly the European nations, of course, are cognizant of the Ukraine conflict, are also reevaluating their global alliances and relationships, and have shifted their postures to be more focused on sovereign national security, which has had an interesting knock-on effect of them thinking about what space systems they need, whether they need their own or want to rely on an ally's. There certainly hasn't been the same focus on targeting of climate research, for example, that we've seen in this administration. But I do think there are budget pressures because of that national security shift and the resources that are being devoted to it.
Okay. Now something that probably takes off from what something you said, Tim. What are some concrete things research universities can do to change the public perception of accountability?
Yeah.
I mean, you gave this wonderful thing about land grant institutions. Why doesn't the public appreciate all this? I mean, how do we change that?
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I mean, I think for every researcher, it's really easy to be just like, hey, just leave me alone, let me sit in my lab and do my thing, right? It's like, hey, guess what? If you're getting paid by the state or by taxpayer money, you're gonna have to take some accountability. And so I think there's multiple layers. As every research university will have a centralized communication organization and a government relations team that thinks about that all day, every day. But I think also just recognizing is that this needs to cascade down, and every researcher needs to, it's part of their responsibility to talk at their school, to participate in science fairs, because the public doesn't really understand a lot of this stuff. It is a black box, right? And so I think just recognizing is that we've got to grassroots this thing, even as we look at, there's organizations like AIAA and other research organizations are thinking about broader strategies. I think it's incumbent on every researcher. Like there's some really cool programs where you can host high school teachers in your lab, right? Where you can host high schoolers in your lab. It's a real pain to host a high schooler in your lab. You got to get special permissions. They don't necessarily know how to use Excel. And the ROI is kind of negative, but I mean, I think it's just think about that there's some broader issues here that you can help deal with.
I think there's a training gap. Yeah. I have, had the privilege of working with some of the most brilliant researchers and technologists in the country. For about a decade, I supported the Advanced Concepts group at NASA. And one of the most striking things to me is the gap, for many, not all, of some of these brilliant people in their ability to describe what they do.
I was going to say that, Clarissa.
So familiar.
I have literally said, had someone so excited, to talk about what they've done, and I've been doing this for a long time. I'm reasonable, and been unable to extract anything from what they said in terms of what they're trying to communicate, because they're based in the jargon. They're focused on the outcome in terms of the outcomes that they're seeking and not the broader context. And so, two things: maybe a training gap on helping people do that more effectively, and also recognizing their different skill sets.
Yes.
I'll make a, I grew up with an artist. My father was an artist, and he made wonderful art, and I enjoyed his art. I did not enjoy hearing him talk about his art. Frankly, it was a little dull. So there are people who are maybe better narrators and storytellers than the researchers themselves. And particularly in a university environment, you have that broader community that can potentially be engaged. So I think that's a really different way of thinking about communication. It's not just the communications team, and you've got a multidisciplinary space institute now, right? To presumably support that kind of communication.
Well, it's not just universities. I mean, NASA, we do a lot of, I still say we, do a lot of foundational research. The International Space Station, I spent 8 years working as the associate program scientist for the research we were doing on the ISS, fundamental research and applied research. And we had a serious communications team trying to translate this very highly technical research we were doing to the public. And people still didn't understand.
Yeah.
Like there's specific ways that you need to engage the public, meet them where they are, break down the technical information in ways that they could understand and get buy-in, right? But it is a problem in terms of scientists being able to communicate what they're doing, the incredible work. I mean, COVID was a perfect example, mRNA vaccines. And the public still didn't understand why that was so critical.
There are some great communicators. Ellen Stofan, I think, was really great, the chief scientist of NASA. Thomas Zurbuchen, just, you know, he tells the story of the James Webb Space Telescope, and it literally brings tears to your eyes. So, and I think those successes, it's not just we're telling a good story so people will give us funding. I think it's genuinely valuable for there to be a broader understanding of what's being done and why.
Sure.
If I can just add one thing, though, it's always good to improve your communication skills, but for all of you, even if you're a lousy communicator, still do it. You know,
Fair
just,
enough.
you know, wherever you are, just talking about what you're doing and why it matters.
Sure.
Okay. So now, Camille, a question for you. You have a startup start to fund research that does not have an obvious path to technology, such as basic physics? You're shaking your head.
No.
Oh, okay.
And why, how would you stay in business? The role of industry and companies are to be in business. You gotta close your business case. So it's not realistic to think that commercial companies would fund research where there's no outcome to growth and high-scale production. It won't happen.
It's not a silly question, though, because we can all point to multiple space startups, not necessarily at the foundational research level, that have started and found funding that had no path to customers. So I think we can continue to relearn that lesson, that exactly as you say.
Yeah, okay. Here's another question, which is highly upvoted. How do you encourage big private sector, as opposed to small startups, I suppose, to spend their own funding instead of depending only on the government for funding? I mean, when you mentioned that companies, they use IR&D funding.
IR.
No, now we're talking about their own funding instead of just depending on the government.
I mean, I think, I guess I see a lot of that happening already. I mean, like at my own institution, I think we probably get $80 million a year from the private sector, largely large industrial, aerospace, national security companies. I think the big thing my big goal is less, I would say obviously we would always like to do more, but I think it's really around moving from a transactional relationship, which can have starts and stops, to a really long-term win-win partnership where there's, you know, if you've got a private for-profit company that has to show returns such that that partnership is showing real value at a quarter level, at a year level, and over a decadal level. And so, I mean, that's where we spend our time thinking around building these partnerships, is something where, you know, it can stand the test of time. It's something that's delivering near-term value, but also giving them sort of insights into these truly disruptive ideas over decadal timeframes.
A perfect example of that, I think, is NVIDIA and Stanford. They're doing a lot of work with Stanford on foundational model development. But I think they're almost $1 trillion company. So there's a lot of room there. There's a lot of revenue there they can use to put back into foundational research, but not everybody could say that.
Okay. Here's another question. The DoD has a new focus on getting technology to the warfighters. It's a good thing. How do you actually see this affecting foundational research? Are they just completely disconnected from each other?
I think if you phrase the question as an either or, you lost, right? It's like how does innovation, I use this word diffusion infrastructure. I mean, how does that work? How does that happen, right? And I think it's this idea that we're creating these ecosystems which are based around cities, great research institutions, et cetera, where you're doing basic research, you're doing applied research, you're starting companies, you're partnering with established companies, you have extension type services, and that's all stirred or in the pot, and everyone's benefiting each other in a synergistic way.
Okay.
And I think also, we're committing that slight fallacy that research is a, institutionally stable linear process.
Oh.
Where, if you've ever tried to track for purposes of measuring impact of, a NASA program that has been transferred and is generating commercial revenue, and you to try to trace back to where was this a NASA activity? You end up tracing it back. So it started out in a university lab, then it jumped over to AFRL because somebody there was interested in it. Oh, and then NASA picked up some variant of it, and Lockheed Martin co-funded it. Right. So and so this kind of web of research relationships and organizations, and I think that reality speaks to the value of establishing those long-term relationships so that you reduce the barriers to those projects and programs and research topics and activities and students and researchers flowing across organizations, seeing the connection between this work that's going on and this objective. And so you can trace that all the way up to deployment.
Yes.
It gets fuzzier and fuzzier the further you get away from, TRL 7.
It's got loops. It's not linear, right?
It's got dead ends. It's got. But I can't imagine that we will get to linear, but we can reduce the barriers in those connections.
So one final question, and then we'll let you make any final comments. So what impact do you see in the delay in SBIR, STTR reauthorization having on fundamental research momentum?
Well, as I understand it, and you probably are closer to this than I am, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act enabled agencies to continue operating those programs absent reauthorization for the moment.
Oh, it did? Okay.
I believe that is the case. I believe that is the case because those programs are continuing. So hopefully in the near term, minimal impact.
But also part of the changes with SBIR, STTR, too, is putting a limit on how many, the lifetime of grants that a particular company could go after. Because there are companies or businesses that have, all they do is SBIR, STTRs.
I know.
20 years of revenues generated. And so they're not incentivized to take that fundamental or basic application and commercialize it. And so I think that's one of the positive things in that's coming out of the new policies.
Okay, we've got 6 minutes. Each of you have the chance to make some final statement relative to this topic of foundational S&T and whatever you want to say relative to it. So, well, Camille, why don't you start with you?
I really would like to see more intentional partnership development between the research community and industry, especially early venture, early startup ventures. At that stage, you don't have a lot of money. You may have a big vision, big strategy for the technology you want to develop, but you don't have the resources and infrastructure. And I think the research community in partnership with industry can really help move that ball forward. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of.
So, Carissa?
On that very topic, so I have a role as an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School, which is great fun. Student founders, and you say student founders, these are very impressive young professionals already typically, will come for advice or strategy support. Typically I get the folks interested in kind of deep tech or government, GovCon. And so many of them have a business in partnership with a patent holder at MIT or a couple of PhD students in a lab at Stanford. So I do think that there absolutely is connectivity that has value, and those relationships are fostered and supported by Harvard through a number of different programs. There are small grants for them to get started. There's the Entrepreneur in Residence program. There's a summer entrepreneurship program. So really it's a partnership between the business school that enables them to work with research institutions. I think generally on this topic, we are in, certainly, we've talked about a lot of positive things. We've had a positive view about a number of things, partly because there was a period not, many months ago where we all, I think, had a very negative view. There was an expectation of real deep cuts in NASA science, for example. The dynamic that has resulted in the position that we're in now comes from advocates in Congress, advocates at universities, advocates at research institutions, communicating, talking about, advocating for, I don't even want to say advocating, making the value proposition clear. And so the pressure, the reasons that there's a sense of, we should cut these budgets, we should spend less on this, those sentiments and those actors have not gone away. So the conversation needs to stay very alive and very at the forefront in order to make sure that the message is being received.
Okay, so in the final 2 minutes.
Yep, my message was to the students and the young researchers here. It's certainly disruptive, but what I would not want for you to take away from what's happened in the last 9 months is this is not a field you want to be in. I think it's super fun field, and you've learned a really important life lesson that resilience matters, and that building a resilient career. Hey, guess what? When we all learned in our textbooks there were these rich English dudes who could self-fund themselves. You've now learned that that's not the way the world works unless you live off a trust fund. We all have to get paid somewhere, and someone has to pay the bills. Okay, so that lesson learned. But I think it's a great field, and there are going to be a ton of opportunities.
Okay, so with that, shall we thank our panel? So thank you for attending this session, and keep on engaging in this debate.